The bar at Athelberg Forward Operating Airfield was not a place of comfort. It was a necessary anesthetic. It smelled of stale beer, ozone from the overworked air purifiers, and the faint, pervasive tang of diesel and grit that blew in from the desolate steppe every time the door wheezed open. The fluorescent lights hummed a weary, monotonous tune, casting a sickly green pallor on the faces of the off-duty pilots and ground crew who slumped over the scarred wooden tables. This was a place at the edge of the world, a listening post staring into the maw of a silent, technological war, and its atmosphere was one of compressed tension, a coiled spring of boredom and adrenaline waiting for a reason to release. Metal clanged on metal from the maintenance bays, a restless and unending percussion against the constant, howling wind that scoured the flat, featureless landscape outside. It was a place designed for function, not humanity, and the souls within it had adapted accordingly, becoming hard, functional, and wary of anything that did not fit the established pattern. She sat alone in the darkest corner, a small island of stillness in the room's tired motion. She wore a standard-issue olive-drab flight suit, but it was devoid of any insignia, any patch of rank or squadron affiliation that might have given her context. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, pale under the harsh lighting, was unremarkable save for the eyes. They were the color of a winter sky, a flat, depthless gray, and they moved with a slow, deliberate economy, absorbing the room not with curiosity, but with the dispassionate air of a scientist observing a colony of insects. She nursed a glass of water, taking small, measured sips, her posture perfect, her presence so quiet and self-contained that she was almost invisible. To the casual observer, she was a ghost, a misplaced civilian contractor, perhaps, or a low-level data analyst who had wandered into the wrong den. She did not belong. The room, in its collective, unspoken judgment, had decided this unanimously. She was an anomaly, and in a world built on rigid uniformity, anomalies were targets. The antagonist arrived not as a man, but as a weather system. Major Kalen Vance, call sign Viper, was the squadron leader, and he carried his authority not like a mantle, but like a club. He was a tall man, built with the broad-shouldered confidence of a life spent being the best, the fastest, the most lethal. His face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, with a square jaw, eyes that perpetually squinted as if sighting a target, and a mouth that was always twisted in a half-smirk of condescending amusement. His flight suit was a tapestry of achievements, each patch a story of a successful sortie, a conquered simulation, a record broken. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace, and the men at the bar turned towards that heat instinctively, their own postures shifting to reflect his dominance. He was the alpha, the apex predator of this small, isolated ecosystem, and his ego was the gravity that held their social order in place. Vance's eyes swept the room, cataloging his domain, and then they landed on the woman in the corner. The smirk on his face tightened. He saw not a person, but a discrepancy, a problem to be solved, an intrusion into his world of steel, fire, and unquestioned masculinity. He saw a small, plain woman in a sterile flight suit, occupying space that belonged to warriors. His mind, a machine honed for snap judgments and threat assessment, categorized her instantly. Harmless, irrelevant, and most importantly, out of place. He began his approach, a lion sauntering towards a field mouse, the men at the bar turning to watch the inevitable spectacle. It was a familiar ritual, the public enforcement of the unspoken rules. He stopped before her table, looming over her, casting her in his considerable shadow. The ambient noise of the bar seemed to dim, the pilots and crew leaning in, hungry for the drama. "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart," he began, his voice a low rumble designed to intimidate. It was the opening salvo he had used 100 times on junior officers and hapless civilians alike. She did not look up. Her gray eyes remained fixed on the condensation trailing down her glass. She gave no sign that she had even heard him, her stillness a perfect, infuriating vacuum. Vance's smirk faltered for a microsecond. He was accustomed to a reaction: fear, defiance, stammering apologies. Silence was not in the tactical playbook. He pressed on, his voice louder now, laced with annoyance. This is the snake pit for pilots, people who actually fly, not whatever it is you do. Push pencils, calibrate coffee machines. A few of his acolytes snickered on cue. The laughter was brittle, more a signal of allegiance than genuine amusement. This time she raised her head. Her eyes met his, and for a moment he felt a strange, unnerving sensation, as if he were being scanned and catalogued by something ancient and utterly indifferent. There was no fear in her gaze, no anger. There was nothing. It was like looking into the lens of a camera. "I am where I am supposed to be," she said. Her voice was quiet, calm, and held a clinical precision that was more unsettling than any shout. It was a simple, declarative statement, stripped of all emotion. The sheer lack of deference was a slap in the face. Vance's face flushed a dull red. His entire identity was built upon a hierarchy she refused to acknowledge. He felt his authority, the very bedrock of his self-worth, being subtly eroded by her infuriating calm. He was a major, a squadron leader, a decorated combat pilot. And this nobody, was dismissing him as if he were a mildly annoying insect. "Supposed to be, who says? Some lab coat in a bunker 1,000 miles from here? You think because you wear the suit, you know what it's like up there? In the dark? You know the pressure, the G-force, the terror when the systems scream and the sky is on fire?" He leaned closer, invading her personal space, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. "You don't. You're a tourist." She did not flinch. She did not lean away. She held his gaze, her own expression unchanging. It was like a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, aware of the threat but utterly unconcerned by it. This complete absence of a typical human response began to truly unnerve him. He was used to pushing people and watching them move. She was an immovable object, a violation of the social physics he had mastered. He needed to provoke a reaction, to force her back into a recognizable box. He reached out and with a flick of his finger, sent her glass of water skittering across the table, its contents splashing onto the grimy floor. "Oops," he said, the word dripping with false sincerity. "Clumsy me." The room held its breath. This was the escalation, the point of no return. She looked down at the spilled water, then back at his face. Her expression remained a placid mask of neutrality. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She simply said with that same chilling, analytical tone, "Your emotional response is disproportionate to the stimulus. It suggests a deep-seated insecurity, likely stemming from a perceived lack of intellectual validation." The clinical diagnosis, delivered with the detached air of a psychiatrist, was more insulting than any curse. It reframed his aggression not as a show of strength, "I should just send in your jank and then," but as a symptom of weakness. The snickers from the onlookers died in their throats, replaced by a tense, uncertain silence. Vance felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He was being psychoanalyzed by a ghost. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. He opened his mouth to deliver a final crushing retort, to verbally obliterate this woman and reassert his dominance once and for all. He never got the chance. A sound cut through the bar, a sound that sliced through the mundane reality of the room and replaced it with a primal, electric fear. It was not the familiar klaxon of a standard scramble alert. This was a high, piercing shriek, a digital scream reserved for only the most catastrophic of events. It was the Omega Protocol alarm. The lights in the bar flickered once, then shifted to a pulsating, blood-red emergency lighting. Every screen, previously showing sports highlights, now displayed a single, stark symbol, a shattered wing inside a red circle. Chaos erupted. Men who had been lounging moments before were on their feet, chairs scraping violently against the concrete floor. The air crackled with shouted questions and panicked orders. The easy camaraderie of the bar evaporated, replaced by the stark, cold professionalism of crisis. But underneath it, there was a current of genuine dread. The Omega Protocol meant one thing: an asset of unimaginable value was in imminent danger of being lost. And at Ethelberg, there was only one asset that warranted such a response. "Tower, this is Viper. What's the situation?" Vance barked into the comlink on his wrist, his personal confrontation with the woman completely forgotten, vaporized by the wave of adrenaline. He was back in his element, a commander in a crisis. The voice that came back was strained, fighting to maintain composure. "It's Seraph 1, Major. He's coming home, and he's falling apart." A collective gasp went through the room. Seraph 1, the F-12 Seraph, was more than an aircraft. It was a myth. A sleek black specter forged from impossible science. A craft capable of flying at altitudes and speeds that belonged to science fiction. It was the single most advanced piece of hardware ever created by human hands. A strategic asset so valuable that its loss would be a geopolitical catastrophe. And its pilot, Lieutenant Commander Ghost Riley, was a legend in his own right, the only man on Earth qualified to fly it. He was also Vance's wingman and closest friend. The base commander's voice, a reedy tenor filled with panic, crackled over the general address system. "All emergency crews to the main runway. We have a code black. I repeat, code black. Seraph 1 is inbound. Multiple cascading system failures. Structural integrity is critical. Flight control, talk to me. Give me a solution." The commander's words were a plea, not a command. The established authority was failing. The by-the-book solutions were useless because there was no book for the Seraph. It was a machine that operated on principles that only a handful of people in the world understood. The men in the control tower were trying to apply the rules of checkers to a game of three-dimensional chess, and they were losing badly. Their voices over the comms were a jumble of contradictory orders and confused jargon, a symphony of incompetence in the face of the unknown. Vance felt a cold dread grip him. He could hear the terror in Riley's voice over the squadron channel, a string of clipped, desperate reports. "Port plasma conduit is offline. Containment field fluctuating. I've lost the primary neural link. The airframe is... It's shedding, tower. It's shedding." The F-12 Seraph, the invincible angel, was dying. And the men in charge, the conventional authorities, were watching it happen, paralyzed by their own ignorance. They were pilots, engineers, and commanders. But in this moment, they were merely spectators at an execution. Then, through the chaos, came a moment of surreal stillness. The woman in the corner stood up. The movement was not hurried or panicked. It was fluid, economical, and imbued with a terrifying sense of purpose. It was as if the Omega alarm had not startled her, but had simply been her cue to enter the stage. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows as she walked from the darkness of her corner toward the operations center door. She moved with the quiet, unstoppable grace of a natural phenomenon, like a tide turning or a storm gathering. Vance, frozen in a state of shock and confusion, watched her go. He saw her pass a junior officer who was fumbling with a data pad. Without breaking stride, she took the pad from his hands, her fingers flying across the screen in a blur of motion, inputting a string of commands so complex they looked like an alien language. She handed it back to the stunned officer and said, "Redirect all auxiliary power from the base shield emitters to the magnetic containment array on runway 1. Do it now." It was not a request. It was an absolute command, delivered in a voice that was no longer quiet, but resonated with an authority that dwarfed his own. It was the voice of someone who did not hope for a solution, but who was the solution. The officer, wide-eyed, simply nodded and ran to execute the order without a second thought. His training ingrained obedience, overriding the fact that the command had come from an unknown, unranked woman. She did not run to the control tower. She simply proceeded, a calm epicenter in the swirling storm of panic. When she arrived, the scene was one of controlled hysteria. The base commander was yelling uselessly at the flight controller, who was staring at his screen, his face ashen. The data cascading down the main display was a waterfall of red alerts, a litany of catastrophic failures. No one paid her any mind as she entered. She was just another body in the crowded, frantic room. She walked directly to the primary command console, the Holy of Holies, a station reserved for the tower chief himself. She placed her hand on the shoulder of the man sitting there. "Get up," she said. The man, a grizzled master sergeant with 30 years of experience, turned to snap at the interruption, but the word died in his throat. He saw her eyes. He saw the absolute, unshakable certainty there. And his lifetime of instinct, of recognizing true command when he saw it, took over. He stood up and stepped aside without a word. She slid into the chair. Her hands moved over the console, not with the frantic pecking of the other operators, but with the fluid, intimate grace of a concert pianist. The room fell silent, the shouting and panic replaced by a stunned, disbelieving quiet. The only sounds were the clicking of the keys and her voice, now amplified over the command frequency, speaking directly to the dying pilot in the sky. Ghost, this is Prometheus. I have control. Disengage the manual override and slave your neural interface to my terminal. Acknowledge. The name Prometheus hung in the air, meaningless to most, but to the pilot of the Seraph, it was a lifeline. A weak, static-laced voice came back over the speakers. Prometheus, thank God, slaving now. What happened next would be spoken of in hushed, reverent tones at Ethelberg for decades to come. It was a masterclass in a discipline that no one in the room even knew existed. The woman, Prometheus, began to speak, and the language that poured from her was a foreign tongue of expertise, a river of technical and strategic imperatives that silenced every amateur in the room. Rerouting plasma flow through the secondary manifold, bypassing the damaged port stabilizer. I'm going to vent atmosphere from the aft engineering bay to counteract the starboard yaw. Expect a hard jolt on my mark. 3, 2, 1. In the sky, the mortally wounded aircraft, which had been tumbling in a death spiral, suddenly lurched, its descent stabilizing into a controlled, if terrifying, glide. Her fingers continued their impossibly fast dance. Ghost, I'm taking direct control of the quantum entanglement core. The containment field is failing. I need to perform a cold reboot. You will lose all primary systems for precisely 12 seconds. Your life support will hold. Do not panic. This is the only way. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was informing him of a physical reality that was about to occur. Major Vance stood in the doorway of the control tower, utterly transfixed. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The small, insignificant woman he had been humiliating moments before was now orchestrating a symphony of salvation, playing the most complex instrument ever built with a virtuosity that was nothing short of supernatural. Her calm was not the absence of emotion. It was the presence of absolute total control. He was watching a god at work. The arrogance and anger he had felt were gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe that bordered on religious fear. The other pilots and crew crowded behind him, their faces a mixture of confusion, shock, and dawning comprehension. They were witnessing the dismantling of their entire worldview, the revelation that the skills they valued, bravery, reflexes, aggression, were crude, primitive tools compared to the cold, intellectual power on display before them. Rebooting core now, she announced, her voice as steady as a surgeon's. On the main screen, 100 red alerts winked out, replaced by a terrifying, blank darkness. For 12 seconds that stretched into an eternity, the Seraph was a dead thing, a multi-billion-dollar coffin falling from the heavens. The room was utterly silent, every person holding their breath. Then, just as she had promised, the screen flickered back to life. A single line of green text appeared. Core stability, 47%. It was a failing grade, but it was not zero. It was life. I have stabilization, she said. Minimal, but it will hold until touchdown. Ghost, the landing gear is fused. We're bringing you in on the magnetic containment array. It's going to be rough. Just keep breathing. She was not just flying the plane anymore. She was willing it to live, her mind a remote extension of its broken systems, her intellect the only thing holding its fragile metal body together. Just as the black shape of the Seraph became visible on the horizon, a new sound intruded, the distinct, high-pitched whine of a priority VTOL transport descending rapidly towards the command tower. The craft landed with a heavy thud, and moments later, the doors to the tower burst open. A man strode in, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was older, his hair a shock of silver, but he moved with the coiled energy of a predator. He wore the uniform of a 4-star general, and his face was a mask of cold fury and command. It was General Marcus Thorne, the head of the entire Advanced Aerospace Weapons Directorate. He was a living legend, a man whose very presence demanded silence and obedience. His eyes, the same chilling gray as the woman's at the console, swept the room, taking in the scene of controlled chaos. "Report!" he boomed, his voice like cracking granite. "Who is in command of this disaster? Who is on the horn with my pilot?" The base commander, pale and sweating, could only stammer, "Sir, we..." General Thorne's gaze was withering. He had no time for incompetence. He followed the eye lines of everyone in the room, which were all fixed on one place, the small woman at the command console. He saw her back, the focused set of her shoulders, and he heard her voice, calm and clear over the comms. "Containment field is holding at 7%. Almost there, Ghost. Stay with me." A flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition, crossed the general's face. He walked forward, his heavy boots echoing on the metal floor, until he stood directly behind her chair. The room watched, breathless, waiting for the explosion. They expected him to rip her from the seat, to demand who she thought she was. Instead, he simply stood there for a long moment, watching her work, his expression shifting from iron-hard anger to something else entirely. A look of profound, almost reverent respect. He looked at the terrified base commander, then at the stunned Major Vance. Then, in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, he gave an order that shattered their reality. "Attention on deck." Instinct drilled into every person in the room by years of training. He took over. Every man, from the lowest airman to Major Vance himself, snapped to perfect, rigid attention. They did it without thinking, a purely reflexive response to the general's command. But the command was not for him. General Thorne's eyes were fixed on the woman in the chair. He held his own salute, a gesture of the highest formal respect, a subordinate acknowledging a superior. And then he spoke, his voice filled with a gravity that descended on the room like a physical weight. "Dr. Thorne, I was not aware you were on site." Dr. Thorne. The name, combined with the general's impossible gesture, landed like a bomb. Vance felt his blood run cold. Thorne. The same name. He stared at the woman's back, then at the general's face, and the catastrophic scale of his mistake began to dawn on him. She did not turn. Her focus was absolute, her concentration a physical force. "Bringing her in," she said, her voice the only sound in the petrified silence. With a final, delicate series of inputs, she guided the crippled, multi-billion-dollar aircraft onto the runway. It landed not with a crash, but with a controlled, screeching slide as the magnetic field fought to cradle the tons of exotic metal. Sparks flew. Emergency foam erupted from the cannons lining the runway, but the cockpit was intact. The Seraph was down. It was alive. Only then did she lean back in the chair, a long, slow breath escaping her lips. The tension in her shoulders dissipated. She turned, her calm gray eyes finally meeting the general's. "She's home, Father," she said quietly. "Father." The word echoed in the dead silence of the tower. Dr. Eris Thorne was not just a tech. She was not just a civilian contractor. She was the daughter of the most powerful man in their world. But the narrator, in a moment of omniscient clarity, knew that this was the least important part of the revelation. The true reveal was in the name she had used on the comms, Prometheus. It was not a random call sign. It was her title. Dr. Eris Thorne was the chief architect and lead designer of the entire F-12 Seraph program. She hadn't just saved the plane, she had saved her own creation. The pilot, Ghost, was not the master of the machine. He was a guest. She was its soul, its creator. She knew its every circuit, its every line of code, because she had written them. She had not been flying the aircraft by remote. She had been performing neurosurgery on its electronic brain from 100 miles away. The men in the room had not just witnessed a skilled operator, they had witnessed a creator communing with her creation on a level they could never comprehend. Major Vance felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The world had been turned upside down. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, and assaulted was, in the only hierarchy that truly mattered, the hierarchy of competence, so far above him as to be a different species. His own achievements, the patches on his suit, the call sign Viper, All felt like children's toys, cheap plastic trinkets in the presence of a true master. The humiliation he had tried to inflict upon her now returned to him a thousandfold, a crushing weight of shame that bent his spine and stole the air from his lungs. He had not merely been rude to a civilian, he had displayed catastrophic ignorance in front of a living legend, the very mind behind the weapon he revered. After the immediate crisis subsided and the ground crews had secured the wounded Seraph, Eris Thorne stood. She walked past the general, her father, and approached Major Vance, who was still standing at a rigid, shamed attention. She stopped in front of him. The entire tower remained silent, watching. This was the reckoning. Everyone expected a tirade, a demand for his bars, a career-ending dressing down. Instead, her voice was quiet, devoid of anger or triumph. It was the voice of a teacher addressing a struggling student. "Major Vance," she began, her tone clinical and precise, "your behavior in the bar was not a personal insult. I am not insulted. It was a tactical failure of the highest order." She let the words sink in. She was reframing his social transgression into the only language he truly understood, the language of combat. Your primary function as a squadron leader is threat and asset assessment. You are required to evaluate personnel and situations based on actionable intelligence, not on superficial, prejudicial data. You looked at me and saw a small woman. You failed to see the most valuable strategic asset on this entire base. Your senses, clouded by ego and cultural bias, provided you with faulty intelligence. And on the basis of that faulty intelligence, you chose to engage a non-hostile in a manner that was inefficient and counterproductive. She took a step closer. He did not dare to meet her eyes. "Had this been a combat scenario," she continued, her voice dropping lower, "had I been an enemy agent who had adopted a non-threatening disguise, your misjudgment would have resulted in the loss of this facility. Your prejudice is a tactical vulnerability. It is a flaw in your operational programming. It makes you a liability to your men and to the mission." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The cold, logical deconstruction of his failure was more devastating than any shouting could ever be. She was dissecting his very soul with the calm precision of a scalpel. General Thorne stepped forward. "Dr. Thorne is correct, Major. Your actions were inexcusable. I am prepared to initiate Uniform Code of Military Justice proceedings immediately." Vance paled. His career was over. But Aris held up a hand then. "That will not be necessary, Father. The Major does not require punishment. He requires re-education." She turned her gaze back to Vance. "Major, as of 1800 hours today, you are reassigned. You will report to me. You will be my new personal aide. You will carry my data pad. You will schedule my simulations. You will sit in every design brief and every systems diagnostic. You will learn every bolt, every wire, and every line of code that holds the Seraph together. You will learn to see beyond the uniform, beyond the gender, beyond the rank, and to recognize competence as the only metric that matters. Your education begins now." Dismissed. It was a masterful subversion of punishment. She had not destroyed him. She had sentenced him to learn. She was forcing him into a position of forced proximity where he would have no choice but to witness her brilliance firsthand every single day. It was not an act of vengeance, but an act of pedagogy, a forced enlightenment. Vance, his face a mask of utter, complete humility, could only manage a choked, "Yes, ma'am." He turned his back ramrod straight and walked out of the tower, a man utterly broken and, perhaps for the first time, ready to be rebuilt. The story of that day, which came to be known as the Prometheus landing, passed into the institutional lore of the Air Force. It became a modern military fable, a teaching tool told to cocky young pilots at the academy to instill a measure of humility. Like all legends, it grew with each telling. The damage to the Seraph became more catastrophic, the storm outside more violent, Major Vance's insults more cartoonishly vile, and Dr. Thorne's commands more impossibly brilliant. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. It was a stark and powerful reminder that the most dangerous weapon is not the one with the sharpest edge, but the one that is underestimated. Years later, at the Air Force War College, A new generation of aspiring squadron leaders sat in a lecture hall. Their instructor was a man in his late 50s, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience, his hair gray at the temples. His name was Colonel Kalen Vance. He was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the service, a man known for his calm demeanor, his meticulous attention to detail, and his uncanny ability to identify and nurture talent in the most unlikely of places. He stood before the class, his old viper swagger long since replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. Your greatest enemy, he told the young, eager faces before him, will not be a bogey on your six or a surface-to-air missile from below. Your greatest enemy is the assumption you carry inside your own head. The assumption that you know what strength looks like, that you know what a warrior looks like, that you know who matters and who does not. He paused and his eyes took on a distant, haunted look. Let me tell you a story, he said, his voice dropping. It's about a time I, as a young, arrogant major, made the mistake of my life. I once picked a fight with a ghost in a bar. I thought she was a nobody. I thought I was the predator, and she was the prey. But I was wrong. I was just a gumming barking at the moon. And I was lucky that the moon decided to teach me about gravity instead of simply letting me float away into the darkness. He spent the next hour telling them the story of the Prometheus landing, using his own profound humiliation as the central lesson. He had not just been re-educated, he had been transformed. He had become the wisest of teachers because he had been the most foolish of students. The story, in the end, is not about one woman or one pilot or one impossible aircraft. It is a lesson carved into the very heart of any institution that prides itself on strength. It is a moral about the fundamental, often ignored schism between appearance and substance. True strength is rarely loud. True authority is not taken, but given, yielded in the presence of undeniable competence. It does not need to boast. Its actions are its argument. The quiet professional, the hidden master, is a recurring archetype for a reason. They are the embodiment of an ideal. That what you are is infinitely more important than what you appear to be. They are a reminder that the most formidable people are often the ones you never see coming. The ones who have mastered their craft so completely that they have no need for the superficial trappings of power. They do not seek validation from the crowd. Their validation comes from the cold, hard logic of results. In a world obsessed with style, they are the champions of substance. They are the quiet ones, the still ones, the observers. And you should pray you never give them a reason to act.